Right on. All right. Welcome
All right.
back. Been a while, huh? It's been months, but this is episode 27 of Conversations from the Underground. Although we have a little bit of a special edition here. Who knows how much longer would have went by if we didn't if we weren't called to do this special edition. It's going to be a little bit different, as you all know who um, follow these conversations. We usually begin with just chopping it up, talking about what's on our mind, and then flow through to some sort of concept, theme, idea that we try to pontificate on for as long as we can, and then relate it to the underground and the things that we're doing in our classes. But today, because we've had so many of our dual credit students asking us about STAAR testing, um, we decided to do a special edition on standardized tests so that we could kind of go over some of the test questions for those of our students who want to get some small tutoring, I guess you could say, or preparation, I guess you could say, for this test, which I've been told is the bar is extremely low in order to pass. I guess we'll see. But nevertheless, because our classes could be so drastically different from these standardized tests, we felt it was a good idea to address some of this stuff, not waste our valuable class time on some standardized testing stuff, but rather just knock it out in our own time. So here we are, man. First off, I guess, how you doing? You doing all right?
So, man. So first off, for a lot of people who don't know, it's Friday. Uh, we normally don't go report to work. Any type of work we're doing on Friday, it's because we want to do work, and so here we are, trying to contribute to this podcast, and hopefully, it's helpful to the students that we're trying to create this for. But at the same time, there's some contextual information, historical information that could explain as to why we're even addressing something like a standardized test at this level of academia. So
Yeah.
I think it'd be a good idea to start off talking about what is a standardized test, why are we using a standardized test, and how that affects us in the work that we're doing. Now, to start off, um, higher education is bleeding into, or vice versa, um, high school campuses, where colleges are um, creating cooperative programs with high school campuses so that students can earn college degrees in the form of an associate's. That's a 2-year degree, usually the first 2 years of your undergraduate degree. And the idea is that while they're earning that associate's degree, they will be completing their requirements to obtain their high school diploma. So they're finding all of the parallels that are aligned with their high school requirements and their first 2 years associate's requirements. That would be your English one, your economics class, maybe a US government class. And of course, the classes that you and I teach, US History 1 and US History 2. We teach them over the course of 2 semesters. And of course, at the high school level, usually in the 11th grade, they'll take a US history class that runs from August to May, and that would encompass 2 semesters for us. Um, but that's at the dual credit level, or any regular class would be at the 11th grade level. As you and I are teaching early college, high school, we're teaching 10th graders at the moment. And and we run into some difficulties with that, especially when it comes to us having to figure out whether or not if our students feel comfortable with this standardized test coming up.
Yeah, man, for real. A lot of important points that we have to talk about here in connection to a lot of what you said. I feel like, I mean, first off, what is this? They call it a STAR test, right?
Mhm.
I didn't know what that meant until one of my students um, asked me about this, and I told her to send me the test. I knew the STAR test was like a standardized test. I think when I was in high school, they called it the TOS test, and then it went to like
Right.
the task test or something. It's changed
Right.
regularly. But I think according to this document she sent me, STAAR stands for State of Texas Assessments of Academic Readiness. So what I mean, what I get by that title is that this is what the government of the state of Texas deems they feel students should know to be academically ready in history.
Yeah.
That's what it means.
That's what it means. Yeah. That's what it always was. The very test that you and I took, like you said, the TOS test or the tax test. This is the newest rendition of it. That's all.
I wonder who makes this. Do historians make this test?
It's in collaboration with um, historians, maybe at the collegiate level. U.S. history teachers are also involved, um, but individuals that are in charge of standardizing, um, there are these things called TEKs, and like they were these essential knowledge pieces of information in history. And the same way that you and I have at the TCC level, there is a district syllabus. And in the district syllabus, there are some curriculum standards we are supposed to address. Now, how we address those standards is totally up to us at the collegiate level because we create our own assessments. The problem here is that there is a standardized test that every student, regardless of instruction, must take. And because of that, I feel at times many teachers simply teach the test because that's the surefire way to ensure that the student passes, the school gets a respectable grade, and there's no rocking of the boat, and they can continue on with whatever they're doing. That's why this is some of the these are some of the negatives of a standardized test is that you end up just teaching the test.
Yeah. So I remember like somebody paid me a small honorarium, like a couple $100, with an email asking me to review. Actually, I don't even think it was an honorarium. Maybe it was. I can't remember what it was called. It was this sort of these people who were creating the AP
Mhm.
standardized test for African American
Right,
history, and I had to read it
right,
over and give them my comments. I don't know what they
right.
ultimately did with those comments or who decided what whether or
Mhm.
not to abide by them. But a lot of what you said makes sense now that it may be some historians or history teachers,
Mhm.
which is different things, right?
Right.
Being consulted, but then it goes back to the legislators of sorts, and they decide ultimately, perhaps. But maybe one of the biggest problems I have with this is that it assumes that history is this objective discipline. Like it makes sense why you need a standardized test to be a nurse because you'll kill somebody if you don't know
Mhm.
what's supposed to happen. Um, but if you look at our district syllabus, it's things like explain the cultural, political, social, and economic history of the United States, which is very broad and allows us to
Mhm.
utilize the subjective skills of history to show students about building arguments, making connections, looking at things from different perspectives than they're used to, asking questions about knowledge and things like that. And I'm guessing I haven't went through this whole test. I've only seen a few pages of it, but I'm guessing there's probably no questions about that, about
No,
cultural
absolutely not. And
perspective and
well, I
things.
mean, that's what ultimately separates um, high school, a secondary education from a post-secondary education. When you arrive at the college, the assumption is that you already have earned or achieved or demonstrated an understanding of basic information. Now that we have that foundation established, then we can pursue. I think what the collegiate standard would be is like explore the cultural blah 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 blah. But you can't do any of that without a foundational understanding of certain facts.
Mm.
And that's what this STAR test is about. The problem that you and I are encountering is we're teaching students are supposed to be a college. We're providing collegiate instruction, yet they don't have the basic facts.
Yeah.
So We're laying down the foundation
Right.
while putting on the frame of the house at the same time.
Right.
It's ridiculous,
Right.
which is why early college, high school probably shouldn't exist.
You're not even
But
let not
that's,
even foundation dry before you start building on it.
dude, we're putting the frame of the house on at this while you're laying while you're rolling out the concrete to put the foundation down. I'm cutting up, um, you know, 4x4s or 2x4s so I can build the frame. And while
Yeah.
it is drying, I'm putting it right on top of it. And that's the difficulty of a 10th grader who's probably 15 or 16 years old at best. They have to understand basic information, then the idiosyncrasies of a professor like yourself or an instructor like myself, as we try to explore deeper conversations that they may not be ready for because they lack the basic information from the start.
Yeah, I hope the parents of these students can can kind of like read or listen to this stuff and kind of see how much pressure this environment puts on their children, and it's
For sure.
dangerous. It's something that it may not be um worth the money you're saving in the long run. Like, there's something about experience in life that helps you see what you're building on top of that foundation better when you're
For sure.
when your foundation is already poured and already solid and already strong, and you begin building on top of it, the structure is more lasting. So to what extent much of what we say to these students is going to stay with them is hard to say. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't genius or brilliant teenagers,
Mhm.
and some of you may be them who are listening to this, but it's okay if you don't succeed at this. That doesn't mean you're a failure, because you're kind of not supposed to succeed because of how tremendously difficult it is. And if you don't, it's okay. Just keep working. Keep. Something separates the people in these classes from others. I believe they have to take some sort of test, but I don't know anything about that test or whether or not that test is relevant enough or good enough to meet the criteria that allows these students to do this without so much struggle. Like, maybe there should be some psychological elements to this test to kind of see what state of mind as you're in as a student before you put this difficult road ahead of them. Um, Hard to
Yeah,
say.
I mean, this not for nothing. This test isn't terribly difficult though.
Mm.
I've taught this test. I used, you know that I've taught high school for 3 years.
That was a long
And
time ago,
the
right?
rates
Oh, yeah.
it is. And when I taught, it was still the STAAR test though.
And I wonder, so this copy we have, does this stuff, it's the same thing to you? Does pretty much the same
I mean, I,
questions?
I bet, dude, I bet it is. Let me put it to you like this, and no disrespect. Um, you know how when we get our schedules, like when we have to pick our schedules, our classes,
Yeah.
a lot of times it feels like they just copy and paste last year's schedule and they just sent it with new dates, but it's the same setup at the same classes in the same rooms at the same times. It's kind of like that, and not for nothing. Why change something or tweak something when it's working? And what I mean by that is, well, how do we measure what's working? I mean, when I taught the test, I had 97% of my students pass it. That was my first year. My second year, 98% of my students passed it. My third year, 99% of my students passed it. I only had one student not pass it. Now, what is the what is the bar for passing? I could be wrong, but I think if you score like anywhere between a 40 and a 60 on the test, that's considered passing.
Yeah. One of my students in the dual in the early college high school, when I announced to them that we would be doing this, said that 36 could be a passing grade. All you need to do is make
Right,
it.
right.
What does that even mean? Like, I mean, how's that? How's
It's
that?
great. Well, like, again, it's the assessment is just, I mean, I'm sorry, the test is just simply to assess basic understanding. And I would argue
But what does
that
that
about
mean?
60,
Does that mean uh we think according to the title, academic readiness is you
Mhm.
get 36% of things correct on a information that's presented to you? Is that what that means?
um yeah, I mean, well, because the test is measuring, like, so there are levels of thinking. And of course, the highest level would be what? Critical analysis. The very basic level of thinking would be something like uh, memorization, basic understanding. Do you know what happened on this date? You know how, like, when you and I teach, we probably don't even teach about or care about dates and, like, things like that. I mean, we have to understand periods of history.
Yeah.
In minute dates, that's just so basic, we may not even really cover it. Again, because the assumption is by the time you're entering a collegiate course, you should already know what happened in 1776. You should already know what is you should be associating with 1861 to 1865. Um,
But
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 that's what this
but
test
but what I'm
measures.
but really what you mean by saying that is by the time you get to do it, you should already know only 36% of this information. You should already know, like, so
But that's at a basic level. You could obviously know more than that, and many do. And I
right.
just told you, like, I had 97% of my students pass the test, and this is at a Title One school. Title One implying that the majority of the students are from a socioeconomically lower income environment.
Mhm.
So that implies that, and the implication behind that is that usually when you come from that in a socioeconomic environment, you may not necessarily have the resources or be ready to do well in school, but students still perform incredibly well. Why? Because we set the bar incredibly low. Maybe that's why so many grown-ups don't even know how our government operates, because they only need to know 36% of information.
Yeah, that was a bit
But
shocking to me.
again, there are tiers to this. So, like, again, there's basic information, like, basic memorization, and then eventually there's something up there along the lines of critical analysis.
I would just be like, well, why don't you just make the test designed to where, like a normal education is, where 70% is considered passing? I mean, uh,
Oh, I see what you're saying.
like, I don't understand
Well, then,
why is it 36? It's
well,
odd.
because then you won't have everyone pass.
Yeah, like, so academic readiness is just not very ready, in my opinion, because you're expected to make a 70 or a C in order to get a C in order for your grade to transfer. Some colleges will take
Mhm.
D, but a D
Well,
is double.
and here's the other concern. Here's the other concern. Not everybody is going to college. Not everyone is forced to go to college.
Good point too. Yeah. So this
At
is just
at the ele- at the elementary, middle school, and high school level, these
so it's
are
like, look,
people
if you're
that
gonna
are
go be a
required
plumber,
by law.
yeah, if you're gonna be a truck driver, or you're gonna be a plumber, or someone who's in a craft or a profession that doesn't have anything to do with these academic things, we still want you to have a basic understanding. Just it doesn't have to
Right.
be as high because yeah, okay, that makes
Exactly. Yeah, because, like, man, not for nothing. Who in the heck wants to be a history teacher or professor?
right.
When are you going to a party and talking about, and you're watching, like, let's say a fight, a boxing fight, or maybe a football game. In the middle of it, you're like, man, that Louisiana Purchase, boy,
Right.
1803. I'll tell you. No, but I mean, rarely do we do that type of stuff. Not to say that there isn't any relevance to it, because there's a lot of relevance to a lot of things.
Sure, but it
But
doesn't make sense though. Like
making those connections require,
yeah,
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 man, most people aren't doing that.
right.
And so, again, and also let us understand the following: the 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 young people that are required to go to school come from an incredibly diverse background of resources, cultures, languages, just headspaces that it would be. Well, I would argue that I bet a lot would argue that it's not fair to have this standard of 70 when there are some students that are taking this test that they're probably learning English. This is their first year learning English. They are required by law, by a certain grade, to take this test, whether they're ready or not. And that's legislative stuff, dude.
Yeah.
This is the difficulty of of these two environments coming together,
Right.
where you have a mandated state assessment at a level of education that is, again, required by law, where we teach at a campus that if you want to go there, go. If you don't, please don't. We don't force anyone to go to college. That's
Right.
why we don't force any standardized assessments. The assessments are created by specialized individuals like you,
Yeah.
and then random people like me.
And if you do go to college, you know that bar is going to elevate. That
For
36%
sure.
going to
For
double,
sure.
right? And even if you don't
Absolutely.
historian, if you want to get a degree, you're going to have to know a higher level of information about multiple disciplines. And that's one of the reasons why
Absolutely.
going to my class, you're going to learn what a historian is. You're going to learn what history is. You're going to learn
Right.
some history as well. This test only applies to point three of that big 3 point that I mentioned right there, right? You
Exactly.
probably not think about what a historian is. You're probably not going to get anything about what history is. You're just going to get about some stuff about some history. In fact, that some history is also going to be highly skewed towards political history and government uh, sanctioned type of history and nation state oriented history, which is only one of a myriad versions and styles and approaches that historians take to looking at the past and understanding the past, many of which many of you would probably know from previous conversations that we've had. Um, yeah, so let's get into this test then. Like, it's an odd first question to me. It says, this timeline is about the national motto of the United States. And then it shows like
Yeah.
dates. Now, is this like supposed to be
Uh,
legit? Like, okay, 1938, all US coins showed the phrase "In God We Trust." That's supposed to be true.
mhm.
And then, is that right? Or
Yeah.
is that,
Yeah.
and then,
No, I mean, it's not made up. No. So I'll say this. Um, the information that you see in the question where it says U.S. national motto, and I wish we could show you guys this question as well. Like if me and if I had better prepared, I would have been able to share my screen and show this to you all. But the first question talks about the U.S. national motto, and then there's a graph, what would you call it, like a date graph or a line
yeah,
graph, or and so there's 1938.
yeah,
And it goes to 1956 and then 1957. And in 1938, it says all US coins show the phrase "In God We Trust." And then the next date is 1956. The US Congress makes "In God We Trust" the national motto. In 1957, the phrase "In God We Trust" first appears on paper money. So it appears that we're working in the 20th century, correct?
yeah,
It appears that we're dealing with um, our economics, right? Because we're talking about what we're putting on our money. Okay. So we have two things to consider here: 20th century economics. Then we look at the questions. The questions say, why did federal leaders have a renewed interest in the phrase "In God We Trust"? First, uh, first answer choice is A. They plan to propose legislation requiring citizens to practice Christianity. Eh, I mean, I think if it was A, they would probably do that in the schools. They're not doing that in schools. They're putting it where? On the money.
yeah. And they say requiring citizens to practice Christianity, that'd be against constitutional amendments and be against the Bill of Rights, would it not?
Yeah, but we already have a history of the government doing things against the Constitution, like limiting free speech and stuff like that. So yeah, that
Yeah,
is true
and they'll make exceptions and explain why, but
for sure.
this is so blatant. I don't think that anyone would be able to say such a thing. You can't require
No,
a citizen to practice any religion. Now you can sort of be like require public schools to have 10 commandments so that people can be exposed to
exactly,
Christianity if you want, but you can't
exactly.
require the kids in there to believe,
Right. So
right?
it
So
can't be A. It
yeah,
can't be A. Number two or B. They plan to address past discrimination against religious minorities. Absolutely not.
I wouldn't.
It's not B.
uh,
C. They wanted to contrast the country with the atheism of the Soviet Union.
That's what I teach.
Of course. Now, why? Let's understand the question. It's regarding the 20th century. The dates that are available are 1938, 1956, 1957. Most of what we cover in the 20th century is under the umbrella of the Cold War. Shortly after the conclusion of World War II, everything follows under that umbrella until the fall of the Soviet Union, which we would argue is like around when? 1991?
Mhm.
Yeah. So that follows in the time frame. Another thing, everything regarding this so-called national motto is dealing with religion, but notice where we're putting the religion. We're putting it on our money. And so that gives me an economic influence. And when you talk about economics, 20th century, I'm thinking capitalism versus communism. And that leads me to question C, or I'm sorry, answer C. Now, answer D says they wanted to signal that the country protected religious freedom. Absolutely not. If we're making a designation towards God and using the word God, um, God is a concept that is accepted in a multitude of areas, like various. There are different words for God, like Jehovah or Allah or Yahweh. Um, Using the word
So,
God, I mean, granted, it's in English, but
so here's my problem with this. Like, and this is why I do not like these objective tests, because I could see myself getting this answer wrong by overthinking it and picking D, because the word signal reminds me of how the United States oftentimes does weave phrases as a signaling to try to impose a dominant culturally hegemonic view of something. So like 100% I talk about how the United States shift towards religiosity after World War II, which is odd because 1938 is before World War II. So I don't even
mm,
really mention that when I talk. I only talk about 56 and 57 because it's in the middle of the HUAC time period. It's in the middle of the second Red Scare. And in 1938, Roosevelt was highly sympathetic to the Soviets. So I'm thinking like maybe if I don't know all the dates as a kid, but I was in my class and you heard me stress so much how in God we trust and one nation under God, which isn't on here, but I also talk about are both elements of 1954, 55, 56, 57 Cold War combativeness. I make the point that Americans became deeply religious. Uh, Jews and Catholics and Protestants united together in the face of atheism, which they thought was this devilish type of um, religion, even though, of course, they don't believe in the devil either. And the United States portrayed being religious, wanted to put a united front about being religious, signal their support of religion as an attempt to separate themselves from the Soviet Union. So I could see how a student who does know good amount of information but is overanalyzing something like this could end up picking something like D instead of C.
yeah, and no, you're right. And by the way, you actually explained why D is the incorrect answer. You say I could see myself picking D, but in order for you to accept D, you're excluding 1938. 1938 is on there for a reason. And even though you have the ability to identify FDR being sympathetic towards communistic regimes, we also should be well aware that you made reference to a second Red Scare, implying that there was a first Red Scare
Yeah.
coming shortly after the rise of the Soviet Union after the Russian Revolution. So, in that first Red Scare, that's during the 1920s. Also, there's a heightened sense of nationalism after World War One. So that's the fact that they have 1938 in this time graph would eliminate D because your purpose for picking D, you said, well, I don't know why they put 1938 in there. That's exactly why they put 1938 in there. So you wouldn't accept D because you're not paying attention to the first part of the graph. The
Yeah.
graph is solid. The question is solid,
That's a good
but
question.
again,
I have to admit.
the student has to understand the entire century.
Yeah. No, I think that's a good question. And also the more you think about D, If the word signaling wasn't in there, I don't think that I would be duped by it. So maybe I can see why 36% may be passing, but if you wanted to increase it to 70% as the requirement, I would recommend taking out. I would recommend rephrasing D so
Mm,
that D would be a guaranteed answer. But it makes sense because this isn't about protecting religious freedom. These statements are about signaling religious support for the theistic belief system in opposition to the Soviet Union, which
mhm.
also makes D in inoperable. You can't pick
Yeah,
D because right. So definitely the answer is C, and I would have to say I think this is a good question because I talk a lot about the Soviet Union and the United States, and I don't
of
think
course.
it's a good question. I didn't really expect myself to like any
Every
of these
every
questions, but question one.
every good U.S. history teacher will talk about the Soviet Union at length uh, regarding the 20th century. I think it's a great question. Also, what me and Brad just did is exactly what I'm sorry, test makers do. They have questions. They have these making a multiple choice question test is difficult because you
Yeah,
have to make sure that
I'm
your questions are not misleading or
right.
confusing with the intent to confuse someone. We simply just want to measure, do you have a basic understanding of the context? And the context here is the 20th century. The context here is religion. The context here is economy. And if anyone properly taught U.S. history, you would know about the Soviet Union and its contrast with the United States, the contrast between communism and capitalism. Now, when we go to question number two, and this is what I like, or not, this is not what I like. This is what I tell a lot of my students who take standardized tests in Texas, especially for the U.S. history test. 60, I don't know the exact number, but a lot of the questions, almost the majority of the questions, the answers can be found in the question.
Mm,
The answers are already there. It doesn't really require uh, this treasure trove of knowledge. If you just simply slow down, read the question, and think about what's in front of you, the answer will present itself. Like, look
mm.
at question number two, and you guys can't see it, and so I apologize. Oh, better yet, what if I did something like this? Let's see.
Yeah,
Like,
do what you got to
yeah,
do. And while I'll
can you
tell
see
you
that?
kind of
Now,
back a little bit. Yeah, now
oh,
the yeah,
not
what's that's showing the Hoover Dam, right? This enormous structure, or you don't even have to know that's a Hoover Dam. Well, actually, it tells you. It says Hoover Dam, which straddles the Arizona and Nevada borders on the Colorado River. And up above the picture, it says this photo shows an important historical structure. Well, I guess it would depend on uh, important to who? Maybe to the government or to the nation. Yeah, but to a man on the street who's I can't get no job while Whitey's on the moon, as Gil Scott Heron used to say in that wonderful song. This ain't important to me. I'm trying to eat
right,
at night. But okay,
right.
so it's important historical structure. They say maybe because it's significant. It's done something that others haven't done before. Is that why? I see me as a historian. I'm gonna get all day long. I'm gonna spend all my time talking about the discussion of whether or not this is an important historical structure. And I'm going out on all these things that don't matter for the student sitting in front of the page taking this test.
And that's fine because at the collegiate level, we should be thinking deeper about these issues. At the
Yeah.
end of the day, though, at the end of the day, for many of the students that might be watching this, what Brad is saying is very important if we're thinking deeply. Remember, this ain't a deep test.
Right.
There are four answers here. One of them is correct. So just
Right.
focus at the four answers and pick the
Right.
best one, obviously.
Yeah.
Like and so what I'm getting at, Brad, is like of course, man, me and you, we could probably chop this thing up for easily for 15 minutes. At the
Yeah.
end of the day, these students only got four answers to choose from. Let's figure it out. And
Right.
let's just eliminate the nonsense. So it says, how does this structure affect the standard of living in the Western United States? Now, first and foremost, the dam is named Hoover. If any student learned anything from our classes, they would know Hoover is associated with what?
Presidency.
No, I mean, a lot of people are associated with presidency. I could say Carter, I could say Eisenhower, I could say, but when you bring up Eisenhower, we're talking about Cold War. We're talking about, oh my goodness, what did he say in his farewell address? Avoid the military industrial
Oh
complex.
yeah, yeah.
When we talk about Hoover, we're talking. This is the president that didn't
Great
cause
depression.
the Great Depression. He didn't cause it, but he made a bad situation worse. So
Yeah,
Hoover is considered one of the most horrible presidents of all time because
right,
of his relationship with the Great Depression. So we need to understand that.
right.
So as you just mentioned with what's his name, Gil Scott Heron,
Yeah.
what's this got to do with me? What does this dam got to do with most Americans who are struggling with the Great Depression at the moment? So that's the context.
Hmm.
All right. That's the context. Now let's look at the how does this structure affect the standard of living? Okay. What is the purpose of a dam? It says, A, it protects the region's natural wildlife habitats and ecosystems. I don't
Oh,
think so. Okay.
theoretically, it could perhaps, in some circumstances, maybe I don't know, but that makes no sense in this context to me.
I mean, a dam doesn't protect an ecosystem
Just
from a company polluting it. A dam just holds back water.
right.
That's all it does.
Got
Okay, so
got
let's look at
some
number two.
system underneath it that desperately needed to not have water. I guess you could. I don't know of any situation like that. So I would never, definitely not pick A.
Let's look at number two. It supplies the region with water and electric power. I would say yes.
Yeah, sounds possible.
Because when you control any natural form of energy, I'm sorry, when you can control any natural element, there is some ability to transform that into energy.
Right.
Okay. So if we're controlling the movement of water, we can use that water to push up against a paddle. And then that paddle can produce what? Energy. We see this with the steam engine. We see this at the Hoover Dam. We can see this with the Tennessee River. I'm sorry, the Tennessee Valley Authority, where the creation of dams produce hydroelectricity. So B is reasonable.
Hmm.
Let's look at C. It supplies the region's demand for continuous job growth. I don't know. I'm looking at the picture. I don't see anybody working.
Oh, it says it fulfills the region's
Okay.
demand for same kind of situation, but maybe a little different. Fulfills the region's demand for continuous job growth. Continuous would be maybe fulfills the
It's a little
demand.
too vague for me.
Yeah, that's implying
It's
that there needs to be. That's implying that you know that the region has a desperate need uh, to fill
right.
jobs. Um, hmm. That's a vague one, but
Yeah.
hard to
It
eliminate.
provides, and then D, it provides the region with improved access to mining. I don't know. There's no context for that.
Yeah,
So we're between B and C then, it sounds like.
right. B
I'm going to
seems
have to
more
argue.
logical,
Absolutely.
more possibly to be true. Um, and I think it's because dams are more associated with water and electric power, and dam is blocking up water that has
Mhm.
water in its answer. The logical thing would be to go with B. But
Absolutely.
here's my question: what the hell does this have to do with history? Why
No.
this sounds like a environmental science academic standard test. It
Mhm.
sounds more like a science. What on earth? The answer, the question itself, the only thing that I see in history here is the image and a discussion and a good debate about the statement above the image. Nothing else about the question or the answers has anything whatsoever to do with the field of history, in my opinion.
Okay. And then my response to that would be the following. All they're doing with this question is using a piece of history to allow a student to observe an image and think critically. That's all. And it's not even really thinking critically. It's just you're looking at a random image that just so happens to be historical, and it's requiring you to think critically about it. That's it. It really doesn't have any historical relevance or context to anything. It's just like, and to put this in a perspective, have you ever watched a movie and the movie was like uh, uh, it was like a comedy, but the comedy was based in a historical time. Now, does you remember this movie, The Three Musketeers, and it was like a goofy, fun movie that Disney put together?
Yeah.
Is it accurate? Probably not. Is it historically deep? Probably not. Was it set in a historical time? Yes, it was. And so all it is it's introducing history so that you can enjoy the movie. In this particular question, it has a historical element to it, but really the focus of the question is not your understanding of history. It's your ability to look at an object and think critically, and then that's all. We move on. That's the
What if
measurement here. Not
the
not
student?
every measurement not every measurement has to be a historical relevant issue. It's your ability to think critically about something that has a little bit of history to it. That's all.
Okay, whatever. Uh, I
But that's
call.
what it is.
I
Yeah, yeah,
just like. I guess, but I could think of a million different ways to do that in a more relevant way than
for sure, for sure.
one to answer a question about the function of something in a society when
Hmm.
we're talking about a history test. I
Right.
mean, weird, but okay, whatever. Next.
Again, not every question is going to be about history.
Yeah,
It's going to
but
have historical elements to just measure understanding, critical thinking, perspective. There are levels of knowledge. When I was teaching high school, they called them teaks. And there's a basic level of knowledge, which is like one's opinion, one's perspective. And then there's elevated forms of knowledge, which would be critical thinking. Um, Evaluation would be one. Synthesis would be one. There's, Bloom's of tech. Have you ever heard of Bloom's taxonomy of knowledge?
yeah, a bunch of terms that people
Yeah,
say, use, and whatever kind
exactly.
of
Well,
crap. Listen,
exactly.
man,
For
look,
people, for
I don't know any. I ain't never done any of this stuff. I don't even remember
right,
passing and taking this test in high school. I didn't listen to a single
right.
thing anybody told me, and I ended up becoming a pretty good historian. I feel
Right.
like this stuff is just so
It's basic. It,
like
it's
same thing with
basic.
like topic sentence one, topic sentence two, thesis this,
Hmm.
thesis that. I just know what a good essay is and what a not good essay is. And I think if you study
But
hard enough,
but
you
but Brad, that's why you're a doctor. Not everyone can do what you do. You, my friend, are one of the few. Many of the students that are taking this class are not going to be able to obtain that level of thinking and performance that you've obtained over the course of your life. Many of them are just on a basic level of understanding this information. They have no desire to do what you're doing, and that's why we're not holding them to that standard. At the end of the day, you, my friend, you're one of the few. I'm
and not
not a
because they
doctor. I'm
can't,
just a
because they can't,
dude.
but like you said, because they don't, maybe they don't want to. They got other desires. So I guess I'm
Yeah, they have
expecting.
other desires.
I'm expecting too much by
Yeah,
saying that
Brad,
we can come up
Brad.
with a better historically
There,
relevant question. I think, but
n- Not everybody gonna wake up on a Friday morning at 8 or 9 a.m. to discuss the history test with a history shirt on, like you and I are.
right,
We're
right.
This is ridiculous. Like what we're doing is crazy. Like that's how much we love this. Like we have a drive for this. We have to understand that almost all of our students don't want to do what you and I are doing right now. They're
Well,
just they're young people. And by the way, they're in the 10th grade. Most of them don't even know how to drive, how to navigate a lane, let alone navigate historical information.
yeah.
So a lot of this stuff has to be basic. Let's look at question 3. And by the way, look, but this is our third question. And um, and look, the answer is right here. All you got to understand is the question. It says this excerpt is from a presidential speech given in the 30s. Okay, so there's the context, the 1930s. What's occurring during the 1930s? The Great Depression. It
Right.
says the speech is given by President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, March 12th, 1933. By the way, Roosevelt was elected in 1932. The excerpt says, it is possible that when the banks resume, a very few people who have not recovered from their fear may again begin withdrawals. Let me make it clear that the banks will take care of all needs. People will again be glad to have their money where it will be safely taken care of and when they can use it conveniently at any time. I can assure you that it is safer to keep your money in a reopened bank than under the mattress. So,
Which my
sounds to
grandma
me like Roosevelt.
fully
Yeah.
accepted.
Okay, so it sounds like people are not. There was a time when people weren't trusting the banks. There was a time when people were putting their money on their mattress instead of putting it in a bank. It
Right.
says, based on the excerpt and your knowledge of U.S. history, which statements describe the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation? Ah, now, if you took a U.S. history class, you should remember your professor bringing up, or I'm sorry, your instructor bringing up the FDIC as a part of the Glass-Steagall Banking Reform Act.
Yeah.
Now, you don't have to know that act, but
We just talked
we
about
do
that.
know that the FDIC, say again?
We just talked about that in last class. I remember I was telling my
Right.
students, if you had back then, if you had $2,500, the government would insure it if it was in the bank account. Today it's $250,000, and I was
Hmm.
trying to tell good financial literacy is if you got anybody got $300,000, they'll look at me. Uh, but if you do have $300,000, you don't want to put it all in the same bank account because if the shit hits the fan, the government will secure 250. But if you put 250 in one bank account, 50,000 in another bank account, now you're secured in both ways, right? And so this is a good example of what the government was trying to do to build confidence back into people putting their money back into circulation in the economy after
Right.
this stagflation kind of mindset was being developed in response to the Great Depression, right? So we talked about
Absolutely.
that. I think a lot of people probably do. That sounds like a solid quote, an excerpt
Now,
from a president's
n-
speech.
now the question is, based on the excerpt from the speech and your knowledge of U.S. history, which statements describe the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation? Select two correct answers. So, number one, it was created as a result of World War One.
Definitely,
Absolutely not.
yeah,
Strike number one. One of its purposes was to maintain financial stability. Keep number two.
yeah, yeah.
It was created as a result of prohibition. Absolutely not. Skip number three.
Why not?
One of its
Because
yeah, prohibition occurred in the early 20s. We're in the 30s.
way off. And
Yeah,
what is prohibition? It ain't got nothing to do with banks, right? You can even do like
right.
prohibition, prohibiting consumption of alcohol. Anyway, no.
Number four. One of its purposes was to increase trade with foreign nations. Absolutely not. Number five. It was created as a result of the Great Depression. When you look at, I mean, and we're done. How difficult is this?
Yeah, unless you don't, if you don't know that FDR was president during the Great Depression, you definitely could get this wrong. Um, so
Yeah. And
that's
if you
something.
don't know that FDR is the president during the Great Depression, you probably shouldn't be passing the US history class.
Yeah,
Like, you know what I'm saying? Like, it's so
yeah,
basic.
right.
So that's three.
That's the easy
Pretty
one.
easy.
All right, what about
Four.
number four? It says this excerpt is from a presidential address made in 2011. Wow. I mean, I never
Mm-hmm.
get 2011 in my class, so depending on what this says may be pretty difficult. But it says, throughout our history, our government has provided cutting edge scientists and inventors with the support that they need. That's what planted the seeds for the internet. That's what helped make possible things like computer chips and GPS. And that's President Barack Obama State of the Union address.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. That's, I would say, weird for a
Sure.
question in a history class because it's too early to me. I don't consider what happened in Barack Obama's presidency history yet, nor anything that came after it. But
Absolutely.
I can understand how some people would and whatever. Okay, but Let's see. What is the question? Which situation resulted in innovations such as computer chips and GPS? Which situation resulted in innovations,
Resulted in
computer chips
it.
and
Okay.
GPS? Which
Okay.
situation? Like, what, what is
Exactly. This is a bad. This is probably going to be a bad question for me starting off, just because of the
it?
context. We shouldn't be discussing anything that hasn't passed the historical benchmark of usually 25 years.
Yeah,
So that's a problem. Number two, let's just go ahead and look at the answers real quick, because one of these answers is correct.
only one.
Right. A shortage of technological advances in other areas of the world. I don't think so one bit. This has nothing to do with other countries.
I'm
This
still
has
a bit,
everything to do with.
I'm still a bit confused about the question. Like, maybe some people need to just read the question over and over again. Which situation resulted in innovations? So there's like a situation. What do you mean by situation? Like something happening, uh, uh, some event? Do they mean by a situation, or they're talking about? I feel like people deserve a better explanation of what a situation would be. But okay, so a situation resulting in innovation. So there's something that took place that caused innovations, like computer chips and GPSs. That's what they're asking.
Yeah. Yeah.
So you say not the first one, a shortage
I don't think so.
of technological advances in other areas of the world. So, in other words, a shortage of technological advances in other areas of the world did not result in innovations such as computer chips and GPSs. We would agree with that, I guess,
Yeah. Right.
right?
Mm.
So maybe like taking if you're confused on the question like I am, maybe taking the answer and inserting it into the question may help you see the answer.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That's exactly what I was going to say. As opposed to thinking any deeper to it, let's read through all the answers real quick and
Yeah,
see if there's one that just like pops out at you. And
right.
if there's one that doesn't pop out at you, ladies and gentlemen, then of course reread the question over and over
Right.
again. But
So
man,
the second
read
then
the answers.
so the second one then we would say increased efforts by companies to improve manufacturing techniques resulted in innovations such as computer chips and GPS. No,
No,
it did. So it can't,
no.
right? Increased efforts in companies to improve manufacturing techniques. Why would that not be right? Well, because manufacturing is usually talking about like cars and metal and
Yeah,
but
but when we enter this technological age of computers, that the car is now the computer. That's why
right.
look at a lot of cars now. They have a lot of electronics in it, a lot of computers in them.
Yeah.
Cars get updates.
Yeah. Yeah.
Cars have Wi-Fi.
So manufacturing is the problem there, maybe. Okay, so what about the techniques?
Back,
Manufacturing problem there.
bad
Uh,
answer.
yeah.
Next. It's
So
a bad
uh,
answer.
a
Next.
rise in competition among technology companies in a free market enterprise system resulted in innovations such as computer chips and GPS. Well, I think this is a highly biased answer if it is number C. And given the fact that we
It
live in a capitalist society that glorifies
of
the free
course.
market system,
Of
even if
course.
you think that it's biased, if you want to get the answer right, you can probably come to the conclusion that that's it.
Absolutely, it's it. It's C. We all know it's C. You know it's C. I know it's C. Students should know it's C. And
But I don't
again, it's
know
for the
that
very.
that's true.
Oh, come on. You know it's.
Even though the answer is C, historically speaking, that's not necessarily true. We don't know that that's true. We don't know that a rise in competition among technological companies in a free enterprise system is what resulted in innovations such as computer chips and GPSs. We know that significant scientific development leading to space exploration was created in a non free enterprise system of the Soviet Union in the 1950s before the United States started catching up with them to go against the moon.
Brad, and okay, so let us understand the following. Yes, they started it. and when I say that, I'm talking about the Soviet Union started space exploration. But because of them starting it, it created competition between the Soviet Union and the United States. And the answer says a rise in competition. Anybody who is as old as you and I are would know that necessity is the mother of invention. And our necessity to remain a superpower in the 20th century. Granted, this is the 21st century in which Barack is giving this address, which is why it's ridiculous. But if we look at the history of the rise in competition, that is a play describing capitalism. And the only time in which our capitalism is threatened, it's when we have competition by way of communism. And then notice it says a free market, I'm sorry, a free enterprise system. So this is question number 4.
That competition
Yeah.
amongst technological companies can also happen outside of a market enterprise system. It could happen for a number of different reasons. I feel threatened, so I got to come up with a new invention. Like that answer doesn't necessarily have to be true. It probably is true in our system.
It's 100% true. We know it's true.
I would say in our system, it could be something else that caused it that I'm not aware of. That some pressure amongst government individuals who are talking to leaders of companies saying, hey, we need this, you need to do this, you need to get it going. And it could have been some struggle between government agencies and CEOs of companies that I'm unaware of that stimulated innovations. But this is just assumption that free market enterprise is what creates all the progress. And so we're going to assume that that's the right thing. I would say it probably is, but it doesn't necessarily have to be true.
That's and Brad, I agree with you, because what you're doing is you're comparing your understanding of what possible truths are around us. And there's a multitude of possible truths. However, every student that's watching this, according to this question, there's only one truth of 4 possibilities. So
Right.
we don't have, Brad, the student only has to figure out, based on these 4 answer choices, which one is the most possible truth.
Yeah.
And that's right. And the only one is what? C.
Yeah.
Because the other 3 are so ridiculous.
Yeah. The next one says decreased use of social media platforms. I mean, I don't know about y'all. I know you're only 13, 14 years old, but it's only been around since, right?
About 2007.
I still don't have any of that shit. I may be the last human left on Earth without social media, but it didn't exist when I was young, so it can't possibly be D.
Yeah, no, it can't be D. So again, I think what, Brad, you're doing is something we would do in our course.
Right.
We would think about a multitude of potential truths, because what you're doing, my friend, is you're splitting atoms. You're splitting atoms constantly. These students only have 4 answer choices. They got to find the best one. The best one is what? C. By the way, I want to remind everybody, you can go and find this exact test, even if, because we don't have the ability. We do have the ability. We did not prepare to share our screen so we could share this document with you. But you could just simply go to Google, type in 2023 STAAR Test US history, and it's like one of the first ones to come up. It's a sample test. Okay, it's 60 pages long. It's in a PDF format. Let's go to question 5 real quick. Brad, you want to take this one, please?
Yeah, let's see. It says, this excerpt is from a civil service law passed by the U.S. Congress in the 1880s. Okay, a lot of people talk about this. It looks like underneath the excerpt, it says Pendleton Civil Service Act of 1883 with a little dash. That's kind of like the historical quotes of the day that I kind of put sometimes. It was a quote and then who said. So this is kind of a similar thing. So most people talk about the Pendleton Civil Service Act of 1883. I don't always talk about it. Sometimes it comes up, sometimes it doesn't. It just depends on how the class flows. Since I never talk about the same thing, or I don't really rely on some script. Sometimes I don't talk about this, but we certainly talk about the progressive era regulatory aspects of society in the late 19th century and early 20th century. So I could see, and if you're reading anything from a textbook or excerpts of stuff, you could get something like this, but you may not need to know all that. So let's just see what the excerpt says. So it says, Examinations shall be practical in their character. Well, if that's, I don't know, this examination, I'm not sure how practical it is, but okay. Examinations shall be practical in their character and shall relate to those matters which will fairly test the relative capacity and fitness of the person's exam to discharge the duties of the service into which they seek to be appointed. Sounds like a little bit of some strange government or lawyer type language that I always can't stand and have to read over multiple times to really comprehend. Sounds like a fancier way to say what the purpose of this test that we're dealing with right now is, just on a
For
more
sure.
level, right? But regardless, that's not the question. That's just this opening act of the question, right? So here's the question based off that. Based on the excerpt that your knowledge, based on the excerpt and your knowledge of U.S. history, why did lawmakers believe that this type of reform was needed? Okay. Was it needed for A, to address reluctance among citizens to join the military? I can't imagine why anyone would think that, because there's no reference whatsoever to the military here. Is there?
Exactly. So now we only have three to choose from. B.
To address the fact that many diplomats refuse to perform their assigned duties?
No, but it's
No.
in the area.
Yeah,
I would say no, but it's in the area.
they're putting this here for a reason, but I don't see anything about diplomats. That doesn't seem right, but we deleted entirely unless I've read everything else. So the next one is to address concerns about the job skills of recent university graduates. Maybe if it didn't say university graduates, job skills kind of makes sense to me from what I read, but university kind of stands out as no way. So I
Right.
don't think I pick C. And then D would be what? To address the practice of elected officials awarding jobs to their political allies.
Gotta be D. It's only D.
Yeah,
The
I
answer is
may
only
not,
D.
if I don't know what's going on in that time period, I may not know that D makes sense as the right answer. But
Well, our
hey,
only options are D and B.
right, so I would be like, going back to the only other option. I would say that sounds like it makes more sense, because it's talking about elected officials instead of diplomats. Diplomats to me is like foreign, overseas type stuff usually.
But if a young student doesn't know who or what a diplomat is, they may confuse it for an elected official. Now, here's what I believe would help a student disregard B.
Yeah,
B says to address the fact that many diplomats refused to perform their assigned tasks.
yeah,
Now, we're talking about a refusal, which means they are aware of what they're supposed to do. They're choosing not to do it. When you look at the excerpt, it is saying simply that there is an exam that has to be practical, that is related to the capacity and fitness of the individual
yeah. Fairly
to
test
discharge duties. Right.
discharge. Right. Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And if elected officials are awarding jobs to their political allies, then that means whether they're qualified or not, they're either nepotism, kitchen cabinet type thing, hooking up people, giving them things that they're not qualified to. Pete Hegseth style. Oh, my bad. Didn't he have? Did he have to pass? Did they have to pass tests? Because I don't know that this Act of 1883 actually does what it's supposed to do. Because I can name a lot of people who surely is qualified to be what
who
they
don't
that
who
they're
don't
doing right.
seem as qualified.
So
I'll say this.
maybe that test is 36% too.
I'll say this, Brad. Look, what you start the context you provided at the beginning of reading this excerpt was important. You put it in the context of the late 19th century, early 20th century. There should be not only there were three major concepts that should be discussed at the end of the 19th century: industrialization, the Gilded Age, imperialization, and maybe progressivism. Maybe. I put progressivism like, man, not until 1900 on. But I understand there's some elements of progress. That
Yeah,
doesn't mean it's
yeah. The Sherman Antitrust Act goes back earlier than this, and I think that's a kind of progressive mindset thing too. And the reason being is because the progressive era begins in Europe, uh,
1876.
1871 or 76,
No,
1870.
the 76 is the Sherman Antitrust Act, I believe.
Yeah, yeah,
I
yeah,
could be wrong. We can fact check it. But I mean, again,
yeah,
we're like one law is not reflective of a movement. When we talk about the progressive movement, we're talking about an onslaught, a multi-pronged approach.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
Oh,
sure, you're
well,
going to
I'm
have
sorry.
one law here and there.
I would say because I think the reason I said 1871 is because that's the same year in which Yellowstone becomes a national park, first national park kind of mindset of
Okay.
holding back, which is also a progressive era thing, right? So there are a few things that I would say begin earlier because the progressive era, what I focus on is the transatlantic phenomenon that begins in Europe and is a response to the Industrial Revolution, which begins there and migrates across the United States. And there are a lot of these graduates from universities who are looking for graduate degrees in the late 19th century, and the United States isn't the world's best place for graduate school at that time. So they go to Europe, they go to Germany, and they get educated over there with progressive era philosophies and ideas on how to regulate problems associated with market revolution and the industrial revolution. And so they bring those ideas back with them and influence the American progressive era movement. But again, none of this stuff matters for the question.
Right. I
One
just
thing I think we're hitting at though is the fact that one of the late 19th century, early 20th century progressive era mindsets begins with this assumption of stamping out corruption. And
mhm,
clearly in that
absolutely.
question, there's this issue of corruption, right?
Right. Yeah. Well, in the excerpt, it's not stressing corruption. Again, man, if you understand eras,
Yeah.
if we know that the late 19th century revolved around industrialization, and as a result of industrialization, a gilded age, as a result of a gilded age, progressive measures, then we can pinpoint how or what could be a correct answer. By the way, just I fact checked Sherman Antitrust Act 1890.
Oh, my
That's
bad.
that's after the
Yeah.
Civil Service Act.
Yeah.
Now, the answer here, ladies and gentlemen, is D. It's just like, and again, if you have a basic understanding of history and memorization of organizing historical periods, you should be able to pinpoint what the theme is going on here. We did this with question number one. Everything on that timeline was in the 20th century. And nothing was more dominant in the 20th century than the Cold War. Nothing was as expansive as communism versus capitalism.
Yeah, it makes sense. No, it definitely makes sense. And I would say that this is a it's a relevant question. It's a question that I think belongs in a history class, although it's political, and as clearly seen by my lack of knowing when the Sherman Antitrust Act is, I'm not a political historian and could really do bits of anything
I
about
mean,
type of stuff. But
hey,
okay, those
in
people.
my mind, I thought 1876, but it's all
Yeah,
good.
I tell my
Figured
kids
it out.
all the time. I'm like, oh, you want to do a primary source analysis on the Federalist Papers? More power to you. You want to? I hate that stuff, and I'll be bored to death trying to even talk about what it is. But I will support you wholeheartedly through and through if you got what one of these papers that you want to investigate, and I'll do everything I can with you because you're my student and I'm with you. But I'm not a political historian. But even without all of that stuff, I think your biggest point here is that you can clearly come to the answer of this if you know a little bit of information.
Right, because remember, the test isn't measuring simple historical facts. The
Right.
test is also measuring your ability to think critically based on the information that's in front of you. Okay? And and
Right.
and in no time, well, no, in every time critical thinking requires in that moment, do you know how to process information and then make an analysis on said information? Look at question number six. Here we are, another timeline. Again, man, all of these questions have the answers in the question. It says here, this timeline shows select events related to the voting rights in the United States, a voting rights timeline. And look at the timeline. It stems from 1964 all the way to 1993. 1964, the 24th Amendment prohibits the poll tax. 1965, the Voting Rights Act prohibits restrictions on voting based on race or color. 1975, the Voting Rights Act expanded, requires multi-language voting materials. 1993, National Voter Registration Act requires states to offer voter registration at multiple locations. Based on the timeline and your knowledge of U.S. history, which statement describes the impact of the civil rights movement on U.S. society? Answer A. It improved the political participation of immigrants?
Except
Maybe.
75 probably did.
That
Could have.
yeah, that would only relate to 1975. So
Yeah.
that's limited. That's a limited answer. So A is limited. B,
Limited.
it decreased the political participation of wealthy individuals?
That doesn't make any
No,
sense.
this has nothing to do with wealthy individuals.
Yeah.
C, it increased the political participation of minorities? Yeah,
Yeah.
I would say so.
Definitely.
Minorities in what capacity? Minorities by way of language, minorities by way of ethnicity, race, or it says here in 65, color. Oh, and minorities based on wealth, because we eliminated the poll tax with 1964.
Yeah.
And then last but not least, it limited the political participation of business owners. Ladies and gentlemen, this is simple.
Uh,
It's
so
what?
like if you're struggling between A and C, I would say this is why it would be C, because A is true. But immigrants are minorities.
Yeah, they
So
are.
and there are
But
there are
look,
other minorities who aren't immigrants that
sure,
also increase political participation. So C is
sure.
more true than A because it includes more people who had their political participation increased or improved, right?
Yeah, and another reason why you would choose C is because again, the 24th Amendment, which has nothing to do with immigrant, race,
Oh,
or minority, I'm sorry, or color. It has to do with your economic access. That you should not be denied the ability to vote simply because you cannot afford that fee to vote.
now
That's that's to protect.
what if 64 and 65 weren't on this timeline and it only had 75 and 93? It would still be
I
C, because of the
I agree.
yeah.
Yeah,
Uh,
I'd
So
agree.
that's the one I think you can come up with, even if you don't get to the Civil Rights Act before you have to take this test, which I can't imagine that happening. But I'm not a high school
Yeah,
teacher,
and
so
by the way, it's the impact of the civil rights movement. So I agree with you. The minorities is a more um, umbrella term,
yeah.
whereas immigrants is very specialized.
Right. Let's see.
Say, and we're already on question 7. I don't know how many questions are there.
It's like 50.
And by there's 50. I don't even know. I haven't taken. Well, obviously, I haven't taken this test in
I
forever. I haven't taught this test forever too.
run out of time. Like, if I was doing this,
I know. Well,
I'd be writing essays on the
uh,
margin talking about, sir, footnote,
let me
footnote. There'd
see.
be footnote on every page.
Oh, no. Hey, there are only 64 questions.
64 questions.
Hmm.
Well, we're not gonna be able to get to all of them because we've already been talking for like
Oh,
an hour.
yeah, I know. Yeah, we're already talking for an hour or so, and I'm gonna have to get out of here pretty soon.
Yeah. Let's go to maybe a couple
Oh,
more. Let's skip one. Here's number 8. It says this question has 2 parts. That's going to be too long. Oh my gosh.
yeah. Pick one more because I got a jet.
Yeah. Let's just talk this one here. This question has 2 parts. First, answer part A, then answer part B. The table provides data about the U.S. economy between 1928 and 1932, which we've already established in previous ones. If you remember, can kind of be the Great Depression, kind of like beginning, right? End of Hoover's presidency, beginning of FDR's presidency. Select the U.S. economic, or this says select economic U.S. data from 1928 to 1932, and it has a graph. Like it says the year, has each one of the years. It says the unemployment rate and shows how it's increasing by percentage, except for one slight decrease. The Dow Jones Industrial Index, which is part of the stock market, if you don't know, but you see it kind of like
Hmm.
and then going down. Uh, federal budget surplus deficit in the millions. You see a bunch
Mm.
of stuff that goes into the negatives by the 1930s, and it says total U.S. exports in the millions. That shows some declining numbers in the years. And then it
Gotcha.
says, Part A, which category from the table best points to one initial cause of the Great Depression? And the answers are unemployment rate, Dow Jones Industrial Average Index, federal budget surplus, or total U.S. exports. Which category from the
Okay.
table best points to one initial cause of the Great Depression? The initial cause. Without looking at the graph, can you see any of these questions that you think you may be able to eliminate? Or do you think you should go back to the graph before you can eliminate any option?
That's a good point. No, because each one of the options is related to the graph. So I don't
You
know
need
if
to
you
know.
can eliminate one. You would just have to you would have to look at the 4 items and figure out which one is most relatable to the Great Depression.
Yeah. So each one of those answers is a column, except the
That's
year,
correct.
right? You got, and then it says unemployment rate, right? And then you're kind of like looking at the numbers there to figure out which
Right.
one be considered one of the first causes
Right.
of the Great Depression.
Now, any student that is being taught the Great Depression or probably not being exposed to what the United States is exporting, they're not probably exposed to what our budget is. They're probably not the Dow Jones, that's the stock market. Now, if you look at this though, the industrial average index, it fluctuates greatly. Um, and so you see a high spike in 29, and also you see it start to decline in 30 and 31 and in
Mhm.
32. So I would argue that that type of roller coaster ride is definitely indicative of what may have been discussed regarding the Roaring Twenties and then
Yeah.
the Great Depression.
And the stock
But
market crash, and it
here you go.
a little bit, and
But
it crashed.
you would have to have knowledge that the Dow Jones has some relationship with the stock market. Now you could also look at your unemployment rate, which is not a cause of the Great Depression. It's more of
Symptom,
a
maybe.
yeah, it's a consequence of the Great Depression.
Yeah.
Your unemployment rate doesn't affect the Great Depression. It's more of a it's not a it's a symptom. It's not one
So,
of the
so based on that reasoning, don't you think you can eliminate unemployment rate before you even look at the graph? Because if you're talking
I
about
would
initial cause,
sure,
unemployment rate, maybe you do need to
sure,
look at, but
yeah,
still, I think unemployment rate tends to be part of a symptom or a effect of it.
sure,
Uh,
yeah. I
and the
mean,
other numbers,
I would eliminate without even looking at the graph. If we just looked at the answers, I would say exports eliminate.
yeah, because it
I
doesn't look
would
like.
say your your budget has nothing to do with the causes of the Great Depression. I would eliminate. It's got to be either A or B. And then, of course, as we've already acknowledged, unemployment is a symptom. It's something that is the result of the Great Depression, not something that is the initial cause of. So I would argue that the stock market struggling would be one of the causes.
Yeah, yeah,
So
no,
I
that
would say B.
yeah, that's a tougher question, but I think you can still get it if you take your time, read it over
For sure.
again about the meaning of all these different things. Um,
Yeah.
I think you can get a handle of that. Okay, and part B of it says, in which way does the table provide evidence to support the answer to part A?
Hmm.
So you already got to know the answer to part A. Uh, it says, by showing how the government began spending far more than it received in
No,
taxes each year, by showing how nearly a quarter of workers lost their job.
no.
It's just kind of is the same thing. That would be close to answer A. By showing how the number of U.S. goods purchased by other countries was reduced by half?
No,
Or showing how the stock market crashed before the onset of other financial problems? So
it's
yeah, that's
easily D. And
easier.
it's because of what we chose for A. I'm sorry, for part A.
Each one of these answers reflects one of the answers for part A. So it's really just kind of
Yeah,
helping you explain why you have the answer. And that would make
right.
a little easier, I think.
For sure.
Okay, right on. Well, I guess that's
Say, man.
good. So I don't know if we'll get a chance to do this again for part 2 before they have to take the test, but I think you kind of, if not, you got some pretty good skills, I think, to, I hope, arm
By the
yourself.
by the by the way, Brad, I want to. I looked through all the questions
Yeah.
for this sample test. All of them are in relation to history 1302, the second half of history. There are no questions on this sample test that address anything that we would cover in our 1301 class. So I hope that if and when people do watch this, they are aware of the scope of that practice test. It's all 1302,
Well, I do see one.
which we don't really get that far in.
Yeah, but I hate to point out, but on number 9, it's about the preamble of the U.S. Constitution, which is part 1. I guess maybe that may be the
Oh,
only one.
well, no, now, well, man, I got to run, but I want to delve into 9, but we'll have to do it next time, dude. I got
Yeah,
to get
yeah,
out of here.
you're right. Most of the stuff is on part 2. I think all of it,
Yeah, most
except
of it is.
right on. Okay, we'll catch up later, man. Appreciate it.
Yeah, I'll holler at you.
Peace.
All right, take it easy.